Charl, I would like to ask you what is probably on the mind of some of our viewers, and that is these terrorists that attacked St. James Church. We'd like to know what type of terrorists were they? I know here in America, we see the rise of communism, we see the rise of Islam, and this is not a coincidental thing. These two have worked together for a long time. Tell us about your experience with these terrorists.
Yes, the people in South Africa that attacked our church are part of an organization called the Azanian People's Liberation Army. They were a breakaway from Nelson Mandela's group, the African National Congress. And so they would be mostly, from their Western perspective, they'd be mostly communist in ideology. In fact, their leader would be. He was a Stalinist. What happened was they were actually being trained by a radical Muslim group in South Africa. And so these people that actually attacked our church, although they would have had communist leanings, they were being trained by Muslims to do these attacks.
This is a concern for us here because we have Islamic groups in Mexico potentially training different people, cartels, things like that. And we're seeing a rise of violence just too close to home right here in America. Now, what are some of the other nations that you travel to in Africa to do your mission work? Tell us a little bit about what goes on there and about can people own firearms in Africa? And if not, what is life like in a nation where you can't own or use a firearm to protect yourself?
Yes, it's really interesting. I work in various nations around Africa, including South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and these areas. And some countries in Africa do have firearm ownership. For instance, Botswana, which is just north of South Africa, they have a very high percentage of firearm owners in the country, mainly long guns, rifles, but there's virtually no crime in the country. Very, very little crime there. Then we have other nations that, like South Africa, where probably 5% of the population actually got firearm licenses. We don't know about the unlicensed, what they call the illegal guns. But there again, the crime rate is so high because the bad guys know that they can do whatever they like. There's so few people that are actually armed with guns to protect themselves. Right. When you get to places like the Congo, which are gun-free zones, then the only people that have guns there are the rebel soldiers and the military. So they can do whatever they want. I've got a friend who's now a Christian pastor who was in the military, who was a man with a gun in the Congo, and he would explain to me how they would just go into a village and just pillage. They would just take whatever they want. So I said, well, how could you do that? He said, well, we were the soldiers, we were the people with the guns, and so what could anybody else do? I then spoke to a former child rebel soldier in America. I interviewed him, in the Congo, I interviewed him, and I was asking him how they did their attacks. So he said, no, we would watch a little village, and then we would surround the village and we would go in just shooting. And we would shoot the children and the husbands, and that as they ran away, we'd shoot them in the back. We didn't care. And then we'd capture some of the children and take them away as slaves. And we would train them to become soldiers like us. Now we're talking about teenagers, young children in some cases. So I said to him, well, what do you think would have happened if all the people in those villages that you attacked were armed? And he looked at me and said, that would have made things really difficult for us. And so in the Congo, I've got colleagues whose pastor friends that I work with there, and their colleagues have been buried alive by rebel soldiers. Churches have been attacked, families have been attacked, they've been scattered for years. Not everybody has a cell phone in those areas. In some of those days, there weren't cell phones around anyway. And families would be separated for years before they could meet up with one another again. And in one case, they came into a church, Pastor Mangombo, and rebel soldiers said to him that your prayers is what's turning the war against us. And if you carry on praying, we're going to bury your pastor alive. They told the congregation. The rebel soldiers said this to the congregation. And so they weren't like our Western churches in South Africa, they didn't have to have a committee meeting to find out whether they should carry on praying or not. They carried on praying. And so the soldiers arrived back and they took the pastor and they buried him alive. And they left his wife and 3 children behind when he died. And I was speaking to another pastor and I said to him, where were the deacons? Where were the men in the church? Why didn't they stand up with their guns and say to the rebels, go ahead, make our day? And he said to me, no, we've been disarmed. And I said, well, was there a law that was passed through Parliament? He said, no. The president decided he's going to disarm the population, so he sent the military in to do house-to-house searches, and they took all our guns away. So I said to him, but it's very difficult to have this kind of thing happening when there's an armed population. And he thought about this, and he said, yes, it's very true that you say that, because there's one area of the country where they haven't been able to disarm the people. And he said, there's no crime in that area at all, coming to think of it. And so the coin dropped for him to understand this. And so you have this devastation where people are completely at the mercy of the rebels and the soldiers in the nation, because they're the ones that are armed and the population cannot defend themselves in any way. We have the same challenges in Zimbabwe and South Africa and all these places, because the armed population are basically sitting ducks and the evil people do not obey the laws anyway. Right. So you might be in a gun-free zone, but the rebel soldiers and the government have still got their guns, and so they can do whatever they like.
Right. And the criminals,
criminals.
Who don't abide by the law anyway.
Government officials, criminals.
Same thing. Well, here in America, we really believe in communication, because honestly, it could be communication that saves us in the event that they begin to confiscate. Let's say they started to confiscate guns in one part of our country. That would alert, through good communication, the rest of us to be on the alert and to position ourselves to where they can't confiscate what we have. And we would be like then the part of the country that still had firearms, right, and we could still protect ourselves. I like to think that living in the middle part of the country, there's a lot more awareness than there might be in some of the blue states here. And I know you're familiar with our politics. Right. So, well, I want to ask you quickly this question. There's one country that is notorious for some of the brutality, some of the attacks on the Christians, especially in the south of Sudan. Tell us, relate a story that some of your colleagues went to Sudan and encountered some people there. I want our listeners and our viewers to get the mentality and the mindset of folks that live in a place like that.
Yes, a few years ago there was a war in Sudan between the north and the south. I'm sure you people can relate to that, where the north was Muslim but the south was Christian. And so they were fighting a war together. And my colleagues in our Christian mission organization at the time, Frontline Fellowship, were busy working amongst the southern Christians and setting up systems in place in the army to teach the Bible, to have prayer meetings, and to reach out to the soldiers and the population.
Like chaplains in the army.
They started a chaplaincy inside the army, that's right. And so with the gospel going forth was very exciting, but a Western team of journalists arrived, and our team of missionaries took them into these war zones to go see what was going on. And so they'd set up interviews with pastors and with military people, and to find out what the situation was, to get a situation report. And they were interviewing one pastor, and the question from the American was, what are your needs? And the pastor looked straight into the camera and said, we need military hardware. It was at that stage that our director stopped the interview and said, look, pastor, the country that this man comes from, you can't say that to the Christian audience on the camera. So he says, well, why not? So our director explained to him that there's some people in America who are Christians who are pacifists. The pastor said, what's a pacifist? Never heard of a pacifist before. So our director went on and explained to him, well, a pacifist is somebody who loves their family very much, but they don't believe that they can protect their family when they're being attacked. And the pastor just shook his head like this and said, well, then they're not Christian. And that was his understanding. If you cannot defend your family, you're not a Christian.
We live in a beautiful country here in America, but many times I think we're out of touch with reality because people who live in places like Sudan, they face these issues every day of oppression and farther than oppression, murder and rape and so on. And we must value our Second Amendment right and our Second Amendment responsibility to be armed and to be trained and to be ready to defend the oppressed and defend the innocent right here in America. And I think that's a perfect example of a mindset that even our Christians, our Christian leaders need to understand that this is part of who we are as a Christian nation.